In a world without fridges or freezers, the Vikings mastered the art of survival by turning food preservation into a powerful weapon against the brutal Nordic winter. The Viking world was shaped by its environment. The Scandinavian climate is harsh, with long winters and short growing seasons. Crops had to be harvested quickly, and meat from hunting or livestock had to be preserved before it spoiled. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of modern science, but they had something just as powerful: observation, ingenuity, and generations of accumulated knowledge. During the summer and fall, Vikings would stockpile as much food as possible, knowing winter would bring scarcity. They also had to consider their seafaring lifestyle. Long voyages required food that was lightweight, durable, and nutritious. This led to the development of a range of preservation techniques, from drying and smoking to fermenting and salting. The ability to preserve food wasn't just about survival, it was about thriving. It allowed Vikings to explore new lands, trade with distant cultures, and build a legacy that still fascinates us today. Salt is a common item in our kitchens today, but for the Vikings, it was a true treasure. In a world without industrial preservatives, salt was the key to keeping meat and fish fresh for months. Salting worked in two main ways: dehydration and creating a hostile environment for bacteria. Vikings would coat pieces of meat or fish with generous layers of salt, which drew out moisture from the food. Without water, the microorganisms that cause decomposition simply couldn't survive. After a few days or weeks, depending on the size of the food, it was ready to be stored. A classic example is stockfish, a dried and salted fish that became a staple of the Viking diet, especially during long sea voyages. Light, nutritious, and durable, stockfish was so valuable that it even served as a form of currency in some trade transactions. But salting wasn't just practical, it also added flavor. The Vikings discovered that salt not only preserved, but also enhanced the natural taste of food. In a world where the variety of spices was limited, that made all the difference. The process of salting was labor-intensive, but highly effective. For fish, Vikings would gut and clean the catch, then layer it with salt in large wooden barrels. The salt would draw out moisture, creating a brine that further preserved the fish. After a few weeks, the fish would be removed, rinsed, and hung to dry. The result was a product that could last for months or even years. For meats, the process was similar but often involved additional steps. Large cuts of meat like pork or beef would be rubbed with salt, and sometimes herbs for added flavor. These cuts would then be stored in cool, dry places, often buried in the ground or kept in cellars. The importance of salt in Viking society cannot be overstated. It was so valuable that it was often used as a form of currency, and its trade routes were closely guarded. In fact, the word salary comes from the Latin salarium, which referred to the payment Roman soldiers received to buy salt. While the Vikings didn't use the term, the concept was the same. Salt was a precious commodity. When we think of fermentation, perhaps artisanal beer or homemade bread comes to mind. But for the Vikings, fermentation was much more than that. It was one of the most important techniques for preserving food and ensuring their survival during the long, dark Nordic winters. Fermentation is a natural process in which microorganisms such as bacteria and yeast transform sugars into acids, gases, or alcohol. This process not only extends the shelf life of food, but can also make it more nutritious and digestible. A classic example in the Viking diet was skyr, a fermented dairy product similar to yogurt, which was rich in protein and could be stored for weeks. Another common fermented food was sauerkraut, made from fermented cabbage. The Vikings discovered that by storing cabbage in sealed containers with salt, it transformed into a tangy, crunchy food full of natural probiotics. In addition to being a source of vitamins during winter, sauerkraut was lightweight and easy to transport, perfect for long journeys. But fermentation wasn't limited to dairy and vegetables. The Vikings also fermented fish, creating dishes like kester, a type of fermented shark that, despite its strong and for many unpleasant odor, was a valuable source of nutrients. Fermentation was therefore true magic for the Vikings. It not only preserved food, but also transformed it, creating unique flavors and ensuring nothing went to waste. Imagine the smell of burning wood mixed with the aroma of fresh meat slowly cooking over embers. For the Vikings, smoking wasn't just a preservation method. It was a sensory experience that turned ordinary food into flavorful, long-lasting delicacies. Smoking worked in two ways. First, the heat from the fire removed moisture from the food, making it harder for bacteria to thrive. Second, the smoke released by burning wood contained natural chemicals like phenol, which acted as preservatives. The result was meat or fish that could last for months without spoiling, while also gaining a unique and distinctive flavor. The Vikings were masters at choosing the right wood for smoking. Woods like oak, ash, and juniper were favorites, each imparting a distinct flavor to the food. For example, juniper, common in Scandinavia, added a slightly sweet and aromatic touch, perfect for meats like pork and lamb. One of the most commonly smoked foods by the Vikings was salmon. After being salted and smoked, it became a portable and durable source of protein, ideal for long journeys or the winter months when fishing was impossible. Additionally, smoking was also used to preserve game meats such as venison and elk, which were essential to the Norse diet. But smoking wasn't just practical, it also had a cultural side. For the Vikings, fire was sacred, associated with the gods and protection. Smoking food was, in a way to bring a bit of that magic into everyday life, turning preservation into an almost spiritual ritual. Sometimes, the simplest solutions are the most effective, and for the Vikings, air drying was one of those brilliant solutions. Picture fish hanging on wooden racks, swaying in the cold northern wind, slowly losing their moisture until they became lightweight and durable. That was the essence of air drying, a technique that turned perishable food into long-lasting supplies. The Nordic climate was the perfect ally for this technique. With constant cold winds and low humidity, the Vikings could dry fish like cod and haddock without the risk of rotting. The process was simple. The fish were gutted, cleaned, and hung on wooden racks where they were exposed to the air for weeks or even months. The result was stockfish, a dry fish that could be stored for years without losing its nutritional value. But drying wasn't limited to fish. Meats like lamb and beef could also be air-dried, especially in colder mountainous regions. These dried meats, similar to modern-day jerky, were a portable and energy-rich source of protein, perfect for warriors on long journeys or families during scarce months. Air drying was so effective that the Vikings even exported their dried fish to other parts of Europe, where it was considered a delicacy. This technique not only ensured the Vikings' survival, but also became an important part of their economy. In a world without electricity, the Vikings had to be creative to keep their food fresh. And what did they have in abundance? Cold, lots of it. During the long Scandinavian winters, nature became the Vikings' greatest ally in food preservation. They used natural caves, deep pits, and even frozen rivers to store meat, fish, and dairy. These locations acted as natural refrigerators, keeping food at temperatures low enough to slow down decomposition. In some regions, the Vikings dug holes in the ground, lined them with stones and snow, and stored their supplies there. During the summer, when the ice melted, they used techniques like burying food in barrels or wooden boxes in shaded areas near cold water sources. These methods ensured that food stayed fresh longer, even in the warmer months. An interesting example was the storage of milk and butter in sealed containers, which were kept in cold streams or buried in the ground. This practice not only preserved dairy, but also helped develop unique flavors thanks to the action of beneficial bacteria in controlled environments. The Vikings were true masters at leveraging their surroundings. In doing so, they created solutions that were as effective as modern technologies, and in many cases, far more sustainable. Imagine a golden protective layer enveloping a piece of meat, keeping it fresh and flavorful for months. That was the magic of fat preservation, a technique the Vikings mastered. Lard, or animal fat, was one of the most valuable resources in food preservation, especially for meats. The process was simple yet effective. After cooking or salting the meat, the Vikings would coat it with a thick layer of melted lard. When the fat cooled, it formed a waterproof barrier that prevented the food from coming into contact with air, avoiding oxidation and bacterial growth. This technique was particularly useful for meats like pork and lamb, which had a high natural fat content. Besides preserving, lard also added flavor and nutrition. Meats preserved this way could be stored in ceramic pots or barrels, ready to be consumed months later. And when it was time to prepare a meal, the fat could be reused to cook other foods like vegetables or bread. A classic example was svid, a traditional Viking dish made with sheep's head preserved in lard. The fat not only kept the meat fresh, but also helped enhance its flavor, creating a rich and nutritious delicacy. Fat preservation was therefore a practical and versatile solution, showing how the Vikings turned simple resources into powerful survival techniques. While meat and fish were essential, grains were the true sustenance of the Viking diet. Bread, porridge, and other grain-based foods not only provided energy, but were also a reliable source of nutrition during the long winters. However, preserving grains and flour required specific techniques to avoid mold and spoilage. The Vikings stored grains like barley, rye, and oats in elevated barns away from ground moisture. These barns were built with wood and lined with straw or clay to keep the grains dry and aerated. Additionally, they used controlled fires to dry the grains before storage, eliminating any trace of moisture that could attract pests. Bread was a staple, but not as we know it today. The Vikings made flat, hard bread like knekkebrød, which could last for months without spoiling. This bread was made with rye flour and water, baked into thin layers, and then air-dried. It was lightweight, easy to carry, and perfect for long journeys or winter months. Moreover, the Vikings also prepared porridges and soups with ground grains, which were quick sources of energy and warmth. These dishes were often enriched with dried fruits, nuts, or honey, creating nutritious and flavorful meals. Honey was much more than a simple sweetener for the Vikings. It was a treasure. Besides being used as a form of currency, honey was a powerful natural preservative. Its antibacterial properties and high sugar concentration made it an essential tool for preserving food, especially fruits. Fruits like apples, pears, and plums were dipped in honey or stored in jars filled with the golden liquid. Honey not only prevented decomposition, but also added a sweet and complex flavor to the food. Additionally, the Vikings used honey to create fermented drinks like mead, which was a ritualistic and celebratory beverage. Honey was also used to preserve meats, especially in combination with other techniques like salting or smoking. This combination created a unique balance of sweet and savory flavors that was highly valued in Viking cuisine. Pickling was another controlled process to avoid the decomposition of food. This could be done by adding salt or some lactic acid and keeping the food under water to keep oxygen away from the product. In this mixture, no microbes could survive and spoil the food. The important thing was that the vessel was waterproof, so the product was kept under the surface. Pickling, of course, keeps the vitamins and nutrition in the vegetables. Boiling was also used, especially for fruits. Foods such as fruit will keep much longer if boiled, so the sugars in them are concentrated. Sometimes honey could be added to boost the effect. Boiling the fruits into a mush and then storing it in jars has been done since antiquity. It may have been used as a condiment. The Vikings' skill in preserving food not only ensured their survival in one of the planet's most hostile environments, but also left a legacy that influenced generations. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more such content.